we see this real resurgence among working people for an ambition to organize and confront capital in the workplace and outside. We know that the labor movement at the AFL-CIO level has no vision.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Harvey J. Kaye is the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, author and editor of numerous works, including Thomas Paine and the Promise of Freedom, and the Promise of America, and the Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR, and The Greatest Generation Truly Great. Harvey, welcome back to the program. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Can you hear us?
I'll just point out that I am now Professor Emeritus. I retired when the pandemic struck. And the second thing is I remain an active member of the American Federation of Teachers by way of the Retiree Council, just so people know, okay? It's good to see you guys. I must be a couple of years, perhaps, since we last spoke. I don't remember. But anyhow, it's good to see you guys.
It's been a minute, and appreciate you being willing to come on. You reached out to us after having listened to Chris Townsend interview with us on Jimmy Carter, and you said that there were a few other things that you wanted to add to that conversation, and so I guess we can start at the election of Jimmy Carter, and I'm interested in kind of similar to if you had a reaction similar to Chris's when Jimmy Carter came into office. Chris talked about he had a certain level of cautious optimism. Like this is a normal guy, a peanut farmer from Georgia. Isn't it cool how down to earth he's seeming at the inauguration and stuff like that? Maybe this will be maybe he'll be a good president for workers and normal Americans. Did you share that reaction when Jimmy Carter was elected?
I did not, in fact.
Wow, Harvey is even more jaded than Chris. That's pretty bleak. I'm going to have to talk to Chris about that and tell him that he's being shown up.
No, actually, he was not alone. I mean, the broad swath of folks from labor to the environmentalists and the consumer rights people, everyone thought Carter might well be a successful, in quotes, though I'm not sure they used it at the time. Then they said liberal, now they would have said progressive president. But here's the thing. People weren't quite aware of where he came from. How was it that the governor of Georgia is all of a sudden a major national figure in the Democratic Party? And I think it's important for all of us to know that, for a start, the 1970s, for all of the troubles of the decade, stagflation, the withdrawal from Vietnam and what that implied in the American empire, a whole host of really troubling things. It was really a lot of people talked about a crisis of democracy. And yet, a lot of people were not talking about what was really happening. It was the beginning, and I'll be blunt about it, of a class war on working people and the democratic achievements of the 1930s and the 1960s. And in fact, Carter is elevated to national prominence in good part because of David Rockefeller. And David Rockefeller at that time was obviously one of the richest men in America and headed the Chase Manhattan Bank. And Rockefeller, like many other corporate and capitalist leaders, was feeling that they saw business, banks, and capital under siege from the 1960s social movements, which included not only labor, but also from the women's movement, from civil rights movement, from the youth movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, consumer rights, and so on. And in 1971, he gave a speech. I believe it was to a convention of bankers, a group of bankers, in which he basically said that business is in disfavor and we have got to do something about it. And at the very same time, there was the very famous Louis Powell memorandum delivered to the Chamber of Commerce. Lewis Powell, being a Virginia lawyer, very prominent figure, who 2 weeks later, after delivering the memo to the Chamber of Commerce, will be nominated by Richard Nixon to the U.S. Supreme Court and, in fact, take his place on the Supreme Court. And Powell was even more direct to the Chamber of Commerce. He laid out a strategy to counter what he saw as the forces mobilizing against capital, against business. And that included, again, all of those movements from the 60s that he presumed, and many corporate leaders presumed, was going to actually become all the more of a democratic surge in the 1970s. Now, back to the Rockefeller thing. Rockefeller organized, and I mean organized, and helped underwrite the creation of something called the Trilateral Commission, which sounds like a conspiracy theory forthcoming, but it was a very open effort. They even published their report, The Crisis of Democracy, with New York University Press in 1975. And the Trilateral Commission was basically, a large corporate association of business leaders and political leaders who might at the time be out of office from Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. And the man who took charge of organizing it for Rockefeller was the big new Brzezinski, who will, of course, become Carter's National Security Council or National Security Advisor, and then Secretary of State, if I've got that in the right order. Here's the thing. There were two members of the Trilateral Commission that are worth noting in particular. One is George H.W. Bush, the Republican, and the other is Jimmy Carter, the Democrat. Okay? So what we find here in the 70s is this mobilization of corporate leaders and corporate friends, you might say, themselves coming out of politics with their own business associations. And this is the beginning, basically, of this class war. The Trilateral Commission itself actually said that democracy was essentially a threat to capitalism. That because of the movements of the 60s, there was what happened. There was a challenge to the authority of wealth. This is all in their report, as I said, which was a public university, not public, but a public document. The University Press had brought it out. And when Carter ran for president, although I didn't know of all the details at the time, and I was living in Louisiana at the time, and it didn't seem, voting in 1976 did not seem terribly important living in Louisiana, a one-party state. Okay, so in the end, I didn't vote in 76. I was convinced that Carter was not a lefty, a progressive. I wasn't even sure of his liberal credentials. I believe his own family were by no means fans of FDR. So, okay, so Carter is elected but there are expectations among environmentalists, consumer rights people, and the labor movement that this will afford an opportunity to accomplish certain things. National health care, okay, an end to Taft-Hartley Act, full employment as basically an economic, if you like, directive. And I mean, I could go on from there. The point is, there were great expectations, and Chris Townsend had every reason to be cautiously optimistic, which I was not. And what happens? What ends up happening? Well, this is a time of high unemployment and a stagnant economy. And by the time from 77 to 78, by 1978, after a year in office, Carter reveals himself to be, and I'll be very, very quick and blunt about it, the first neoliberal president. That was a term that people didn't even know at the time, but he launches what is called neoliberalism. He goes in front of the American people in 1978 in a series of speeches, and the most significant one is one in which he says this, and I quote, he spoke to the nation on the need to fight inflation and cut the government deficit instead of fighting unemployment. And then he said, we must face a time of national austerity. Now, what's the byword of neoliberalism? Austerity. So it's Carter who launches this neoliberal politics and political economy. He also says, essentially, in a speech that followed, that it was time to liberate capital, or he said probably liberate business. And the idea was to deregulate because why? Government can't solve all our problems. This is his own words. Cannot solve all our problems. Okay, so basically we've got to basically saying let's turn to business and let's let them run free. Basically, okay. Now, what does this imply? Well, first of all, the class war is underway. And Doug Frazier, who was then the president of the UAW, who was a member of the President's Labor Management Council, this sort of group of business and labor figures who were discussing important affairs of the day, he actually sends an open letter to Carter. And he says that he is resigning from this council. Why? He says, and I'm quoting, "I believe leaders of the business community have chosen to wage a one-sided class war today in this country, a war against working people, the unemployed, the poor, the minorities, the very young and the very old, and even many in the middle class of our society." I mean, so Chris is what Chris said at a personal level and his observations absolutely on target. But I thought it's really important to know that Jimmy Carter paved the way to Ronald Reagan and basically moved the Democratic Party basically to neoliberalism. And the presidencies of Carter, Clinton, Obama, and to a surprisingly lesser extent, Biden, because Biden was a champion of neoliberalism for his 40 years in Congress, he actually sort of started to abandon by no means was he a left president, but he did in fact begin to do things that implied a possibility of breaking with neoliberalism. I'm not here to defend Biden. The point is, it's important for all of us to understand that this class war that we of labor have endured is 50 years. I'm not kidding, 50 years. So anyhow, those are I just wanted to put it into that kind of historical context.
Yeah, I think that is a really important historical context. Another thing that you mentioned that we didn't get into in our conversation with Chris Townsend was his appointment of Paul Volcker, I think his name was, to the Federal Reserve, and the Volcker shock and kind of Carter's response to inflation. Can you talk to us about that and how that affected how his response to inflation affected working people and what alternatives, existed to combat inflation instead of what he ultimately did, which was, austerity and hurting people?
Well, basically Volcker as head of the Federal, appointed by Carter, who, by the way, Ronald Reagan kept on at the Federal Reserve. Basically, he set it up so that who would bear the burden of fighting the crisis of stagflation? Working people. So companies laid off workers, okay, accelerated their efforts to smash unions, okay. And there's something else I left out, and this is part of it. It's so like both ends of the decade. American business was not only under siege from below in the United States, it was actually under siege in terms of Japanese and West German industrial enterprises. They had now recovered from the devastation of World War II, and they were giving a real bit of competition to American capital. So there was, both in Britain and the United States, what came to be called a profit squeeze. Now, how do you respond to a profit squeeze? You have to cut the costs if you're not going to do remarkable innovation. And what did they do? They went out to smash labor, to bust unions, to take back the arrangements in contracts. So labor is already under siege throughout this decade. And of course, when you've got a Federal Reserve chair who's determined to drive up unemployment because companies will probably reduce their workload in light of the response by the Federal Reserve to the stagflation. And let's not forget, there later ensues the further Volcker reign in the Federal Reserve, the Reagan recession, which is all the more an opportunity to smash labor, okay? And this really is, sort of the edges of the 70s. We used to joke about the fact the 70s were awful because of what? Bell bottoms and disco balls and all that kind of stuff. But actually, what makes the 70s horrific is the class war on labor and working people.
Right, right. What were some alternative paths that Carter could have taken to address the inflation crisis?
Well, you've now posed the question that I hope someday we can turn to in a separate conversation. You know, if there's a problem in the economy, if unemployment's high and if inflation's high, we've allowed ourselves to believe, if you want to believe, the current regime and the Musk folks, that it's government spending which drives up inflation, instead of talking about the degree to which corporations will price gouge, the degree to which banking rates will be driven up by Federal Reserve officers. I mean, it's all of these kinds of things. And so what could have been done? Well, for a start, I think the kinds of things that the social movements of the day. We'll start with consumer folks. Okay, regulate business all the more effectively. Back in the 60s, business was revealed to have lied repeatedly. The drug companies had lied about the significance of the drugs they were bringing onto the market, such as thalidomide. Okay, pollution they had avoided as an issue, and which leads to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And moreover, of course, labor's demands, which were still based on the New Deal ideal, and that is national health care, et cetera. So if they had pursued in 1978, if the Carter and the Democrats had pursued consumer rights, regulation of business, they would have had greater say over what's going on in the corporate world. Number two, the environmental movement was not a threat and not by any means the cause of inflation. It was going to make the costs of business activity less oppressive to working people and middle class and other people. And of course, give labor a capacity to organize in the South. I mean, the big question, look, Taft-Hartley Act, amongst many other things, basically allowed Southern states to pass right-to-work laws and block labor's organizing efforts in the South, which also severely cost the advance of civil rights and basically in many ways separates civil rights and labor rights, which should never have happened. Okay. So I may not have answered your question directly, but I would say that if you're going to face a crisis, and this is what Lincoln knew and what FDR knew, if you're facing a crisis, which has become a crisis of democracy, then you have to bring about what people like to call progressive. I'd go further and say radical change. The New Deal faced a crisis of democracy and the economy at the same time. And by the time the U.S. entered the Second World War, the American economy was greatly recovered. And essentially, the labor movement had a vision coming out of the New Deal and out of the war effort of a real social democratic America. And again, as I said, I know I sent you a message. Sometime we should talk about labor's vision of the 30s, 40s, and beyond, and how every effort was made to contain and smash that vision, which is why the class war has been so successful. And even now that we see this real resurgence among working people for a desire, for an aspiration, for an ambition to organize and confront capital in the workplace and outside, we know that the labor movement at the AFL-CIO level has no vision.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
You take a lot from the legacy of, in particular, Thomas Paine and FDR. I haven't read your book about the Four Freedoms, but I did read your book about Thomas Paine, and it was really, really interesting and a really cool piece of history that a lot of people would not know if they did not read your book. And so they should read your book about Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. But, how do you see today as Biden has left office and Trump enters office, how do you see Carter's legacy impacting the office of the presidency and what we can expect potentially from the Trump administration?
Well, let's put it this way. I saw that. I have always said to people, shock them. Look, Carter was a very sweet and a very good man in his post-presidential years. But as a president, for the sake of working people, he was awful. Right. Awful. Okay. And in essence, he empowers the neoliberalism. He empowers the Reagan presidency. I mean, Carter deregulated finance, he deregulated transportation, and he turned his back on the very things that were essential, basically, to continuing the legacy of the 30s and the 60s. So now, after these 50 years, how do I see it? I see this as literally the darkest outcome of that 50-year class war. Now, here's why. Working people are not instinctively, they're not instinctively conservative. They're instinctively eager for what back in the, the 19th century and the early 20th century was at least a decent American standard of living, which they believe they have a right to, going back to the Declaration of Independence with all the flaws of the founders: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Ask yourself in 20th and 21st century terms what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness requires. And then you'll recall 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours for what we will. Now, that was a vision which actually greatly influenced FDR in the 1930s. And it was a vision that then he rearticulates in terms of what he called the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And later, he calls for an economic bill of rights. So the outcome of 50 years of smashing, if you like, the memory of that vision and smashing the unions who were the carriers of that vision, well, what do you see? What have we seen for the past 50 years? Gross inequalities, and working people have gotten to the point where they're fed up with the Democrats. They're fed up with neoliberalism. And I'll go further. Look, in 2016, when we voted in 2016 here in Wisconsin, everyone assumed the Democrats, working people who generally would have voted Democratic, were going to turn out for Hillary Clinton. But what did they do? Well, they remembered Bill Clinton and NAFTA. They remembered Bill Clinton and the end of the aid to families with dependent children. They remembered mass incarceration. They remembered the smashing of much of what remained of the New Deal during a Democratic president. And later, I mean, in 2016, a lot of them were just not going to vote for Hillary Clinton. Admittedly, she didn't come to Wisconsin. She didn't go to Michigan. She didn't go to Pennsylvania, which added insult to, on top of the injuries, or if you like. And she lost, even though she won, a greater share of the popular vote across the country. But she lost these three key states and the working people's votes within them. And I can tell you, I think a lot of working people are voting because they want to give the Democrats a bloody nose. That's how I view it in the most simple terms. And look, Bernie would have won in 2016. He would have won in 2020. And if he had been younger, he would have won this time, if he had decided to run. Working people back in 2016, and I could tell you this from the students I had who ultimately confessed that they voted for Trump because their parents did. These are the 18-year-olds who just came as freshmen. They would say, my parents wanted to vote for Bernie, but he wasn't the candidate, so they voted for Trump because they were angry. They were upset. These are both rural and urban voters, their parents. Sorry, if I'm sounding simplistic as a historian, it's only because I'm trying to condense, because I know we don't have a lot of time.
No, I think this has been excellent. And I want to kind of pick up with where you left off here with this 50-year outcome of the neoliberal class war and the situation we're facing today with the far right being ascendant, having control over all three branches of the federal government down to many of the state and local governments, especially here in the South. I don't think it's very controversial to say that we live in an oligarchy. So,
yes.
Where does that leave us now? You mentioned Bernie would have won. Let's pick up with that. Those of us who want to see a progressive working class populist upsurge,
Right.
at the very least, however you want to get into the details of that. But, we want to see another revival of the working class as an organized political and social movement, like we saw from the 30s through the 60s, where we had this massive wave of people power that brought real material progress. So for those of us who want to see that, those of us who understand that is how we move forward, is that kind of people power. Where are we left today? Where are we to make of this, and where we go next?
Okay. Let me put it this way. I've been talking for now several years with, I'm not a labor leader. I'm a labor member. I'm a brother of the American Federation of Teachers. But I've said to a number of people, and I'm proud to say a good friend of mine is Sarah Nelson. And I said to her, and we've agreed, the one force that can save democracy is the labor movement, but not as it's currently configured. Okay, I mean, it's wonderful to see and hear Sean Fain. It's wonderful to see the UAW on the march. It's great to know that Amazon workers are fed up and eager to organize. It's great to know Starbucks. But here's the thing: the vast majority of folks are not organizing right now, and they need to know that there's more than it. That as much as they'll say yes, we like the idea of labor, they need to know that the cause of labor is not only in those kinds of workplaces, whether it's the higher paid UAW worker or the lower paid Amazon and especially Starbucks workers. They need to hear labor speak American. They need to hear like the likes of Sean Fain. Look, Sean McBride talking not about which party is going to do this or that for them, but what labor as a driving force can do. I mean, my hopes had been that by this time, the AFL-CIO would have been led by Sarah Nelson, not by Liz Shuler. Okay, that there would have been a more dynamic, a more militant, more energetic and enthusiastic leadership, a leadership at the AFL-CIO. In the meantime, through our own unions, we're going to have to start, if you like, demanding from the local to the state and beyond, that these unions not only do what they're doing. Organizing is fundamental and essential, but it's not enough. We have to start speaking of a vision which will not only sort of enhance the organizing efforts, but a vision which will attract people. Okay? I mean, look, in 1944, FDR gave a State of the Union address in which he laid out an economic bill of rights, guaranteed health care, guaranteed jobs with a living wage, guaranteed education as far as your capacities could take you, free public education. I mean, a whole host of things, and I'm leaving out a longer list. But as soon as the labor movement heard that, as soon as the leaders, and there were two federations at the time, the AFL and the CIO, the trades and the industrial unions. Both union federations immediately grabbed hold of that and not only worked hard to get FDR reelected to a fourth term, which he would die not long after he was inaugurated, but they made the Economic Bill of Rights fundamental to their own politics. They went out and they organized vast drives in favor of not only Roosevelt, but of securing an Economic Bill of Rights. And by the way, that remained part of their vision right through to the 1960s. And it's only indeed in the course of the 70s when that kind of thing is forgotten, you might say. And don't forget, the right and the neolibs were very good at making an issue of what was going on in schools and in universities and the teaching of history. Well, how often have you heard of labor history being taught in the schools? How often have you heard of an Economic Bill of Rights spoken of? The Democrats, by the way, who sustained the vision? A. Philip Randolph. Okay? A. Philip Randolph sustained the vision and issued the Freedom Budget in 1965, a call for the federal government to go beyond the Great Society and lay out a 10-year plan to end poverty and redevelop rural and urban areas. And it was all framed in terms of FDR's Four Freedoms and Economic Bill of Rights. Later, Martin Luther King Jr., not long before his assassination in Memphis, called for an Economic Bill of Rights. Bernie would later call for an economic bill of rights, but he didn't do it aggressively enough. It was on the website, but it wasn't aggressively enough. The point is that we need to have labor leaders embrace these kinds of things as part of their organizing effort in order to draw in others to the movement and to inspire their own workers as to where we're going. And the Democrats, I'm sorry, I'm throwing a million things onto the table. In 1972, the AFL-CIO, because of the McGovern Commission of 1968 and 69 and 70, basically lost its seat at the table in the Democratic Party. I want to see the Democratic Party reinvite the labor movement back into the party. And in fact, whatever I thought of Sean McBride's speech, if I got the name right, or is it O'Brien? Sorry, who I mean,
O'Brien, yeah. Is that who you're thinking of with the Teamsters? Yeah.
Right, sorry, I said the wrong name. O'Brien, when he went to the Republican convention and kissed, Vance and Trump, basically he was angry. He was angry on behalf of labor folks for quite some time. And the Democrats had no sense of history. Hell, they should have invited him along with Thane to the Democratic convention. The point is the Democrats have got to not only mouth, yeah, we're going to be the party that's going to support working people. They have to make it the party of working people and the labor movement.
Right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I really appreciate, what you're saying in terms of bringing people into a broad vision of the future and how things could be better, how we as Americans could really, live out these promises that have been made to us. And, because bottom line, we have to get millions of unorganized workers to start organizing, right? We have to have millions of people to get engaged with this movement, to make it a movement that is actually going somewhere beyond encirclement and retreat and defeat, which, it has been throughout this 50-year class war we've been discussing. Labor's percentage of the workforce has just continued to decline year after year after year. We'll see the new statistics coming out next week. I won't hold my breath for them. I don't know what it's going to look like, but even with the labor resurgence of the last few years, the popularity's through the roof. We're in the media more than we've ever been in our lifetimes, certainly me or Jacob's lifetime, but, it hasn't reflected in actual concrete membership numbers. We're not keeping up with the population. And so I think that's really important, that broad vision, something that really engages people to take a risk and because it is a risk, particularly here in the South, to even, talk union is almost a scandalous thing in some environments. And for people to want to take that risk to, stick their neck out, it has to be about something bigger than themselves, bigger than, anything that we're looking at now in terms of what's on offer from contemporary politics. So really appreciate that. And that, Jacob, I don't know what you had.
Yeah, that's it, Harvey. Unless you had, do you have any other any closing thoughts?
Well, let's put it this way: after the past week, past week and the nightmare that's ensuing, I think if we don't see some energy coming out of labor in terms of not just saying, well, we can, let's see what happens with the National Labor Relations Act. I mean, here's the last thought. I said to someone a couple of weeks ago when they nominated, the woman's name escapes me, the congresswoman who is now going to become presumably the Secretary of Labor,
Lori Chavez DeRemer.
Right. She's an unusual appointment for the Trump administration. But there's a force inside of the Republican Party which is trying to really lay hold of the working class and even trying to appeal to labor. And bizarrely enough, that's Josh Hawley, who's very, very eager to be seen as a champion of working people, as was Marco Rubio hoping to do that. And I can tell you that if the Democrats don't figure out how to make more of their own history and how to, in essence, line up with labor, we're all going to be in for a really big shock.
Right. Yeah.
I did have another
Okay, yeah.
question if you've got time, Harvey, and it comes
I've
from,
got time.
Yeah, it comes from, conversations we're having, particularly here in Alabama, where things are just so bleak in terms of the Democratic Party.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I guess my question would be for those of us who want to see this change and want to see a real response, is working within the Democratic Party the right answer now? Or are there alternatives that we should be considering? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my sense is that it would take too long, not for me to talk about it, too long to start creating the alternative to the Democratic Party. Okay. And that's why I think the alternative has to be from labor compelling the Democratic Party to become what it once was and might yet become again. Okay. I mean, I don't see a third party as an alternative. To me, the alternative is the labor movement really taking hold of the Democratic Party as much as possible. Unfortunately, there are labor leaders and friends of mine included who say, well, it's not worth pursuing politics right now. The Democratic Party is so bad. No, what is imperative is don't have an inside and outside perspective. You got to do both at the same time. That's the point.
Right. And I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about it, which I won't get into here, but I will just say that in the time period you really focused on in terms of the 30s and the 40s and in through the 50s and 60s, labor was so powerful, right, that both parties to varying degrees tried to appease us, tried to cater to us, right? And it was not as uncommon to have, pro-labor Republicans at the time, even staunchly bigoted, racist Dixiecrats in some cases were throwing, token concessions to the labor movement, in part because of our real genuine strength, right? So I think there's definitely something to that.
Don't read too much into the kisses they might have sent. The Dixiecrats, they opposed labor as much as they opposed desegregation, because they knew that in spite of the racism that tended to prevail in the labor movement in the South at the time, that labor was going to bring an end to segregation. They knew it. I mean, I know the racism of labor coming out of the AFL-CIO, but don't forget, A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a black union, never left the AFL-CIO in favor of the CIO. And that tells you something about what he saw as possibilities that remained. Now, Dixiecrats did not want to embrace anything about labor. That's why Taft-Hartley Act is enacted in 1947, because the Southern Democrats and the Republicans made it happen. By the way, the reason that Southern Democrats didn't want national health care was not because it sounded socialist. They didn't want national health care because they didn't want to desegregate hospitals. I mean, they were driven by white supremacy, basically. And by the way, this is all in my book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. Okay. I mean, they even try to use the Four Freedoms idea against national health care, which the mind boggles the mind. It just.
Right. Well, Harvey, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Enjoy the conversation and look forward to bringing you on again.
Thank you. You guys are great. Keep up the good work.
Appreciate it.
Harvey J. Kaye is Professor Emeritus, the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor Emeritus of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Also a member of the American Federation of Teachers. Really appreciate Harvey taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Lots of food for thought there.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.